So this is for learning and cognition, and we're looking at Chapter 10, Intelligence. Now, Martinez, he started this chapter discussing the various perspectives on the definition of intelligence, as well as the controversy that surrounds this definition. Burton, who did an article in Psychology Today back in 2019, reviewed the origins of intelligence. And Burton actually, he recommended that we should start by looking at dementia or Alzheimer's to begin to define intelligence, and that there's a disturbance of multiple higher cortical functioning that would include one's memory, thinking, orientation, comprehension, the ability to calculate, learning capacity, language, as well as judgment. His thought was that it's significant that people with dementia or severe learning difficulties cope very poorly with changes to their environment. And as such, moving into a care home or even into a room can be quite difficult. And looking at all this, he suggested that at its broadest, intelligence really refers to the functioning of a number of related faculties as well as abilities that would enable us to adapt and respond to environmental pressures. And because of this, it's not beyond just humans, but as far as animals and even plant life can also possess intelligence. So really, in terms of defining, a simple definition may be that intelligence comprises our ability to think, understand, and be able to use the information to build our knowledge base. Western regions, it's believed that intelligence really involves our ability to analyze things. And this tenet has a philosophical basis that originated from ancient Greece and philosophers such as Socrates as well as Plato, and among other ones. However, we've come to learn that intelligence is more in depth and actually possesses several facets, of which we'll be talking about throughout this chapter. So if we go on the notion that intelligence goes beyond just looking at the analytical, then we have to also, when we're talking about what is intelligence, look at the different theories. We're familiar with three broad categories in which people would learn from, that being visual learning, auditory learning, as well as kinesthetic learning. And beyond these three categories, there's been many theories as well as approaches toward human learning potential that's been established. And among that theory, multiple intelligence have been developed, and that was by Howard Gardner, along with, excuse me, John and Elizabeth Hobbs in the cognition education at Harvard Graduate School for Education in Harvard University. Now, Gardner's early work in psychology and later in human cognition, as well as the human potential, led to the development of an initial 6 different intelligence. However, now there's 9 intelligence, and there still can be a possibility of more to expand the list. But with Gardner's multiple intelligence, let's take a look at it, and I'm just going to provide like a summary of it. First being the verbal linguistic intelligence. Now this is one that's well developed in terms of verbal skills, as well as looking at the sensitivity to sounds, meanings, as well as rhythms of words. The second one would be the logical mathematical intelligence. This is where we have the ability to think conceptually as well as abstractly, and we are able to possess a capacity to discern between logical and numerical patterns. The third one is spatial visual intelligence. Here it's our capacity to be able to think in terms of images and pictures and to be able to visualize accurately as well as abstractly. Fourth one would be bodily kinesthetic intelligence, and that's our ability to be able to control one's body movements and to be able to handle objects skillfully, hand-eye coordination as such. The next one is musical intelligence, and here it's our ability to be able to produce as well as appreciate rhythms, pitch, timbres, etc. and be able to mold those different pitches and timbres and rhythms into a knowledgeable sound that we all can understand and appreciate. 6.1 is interpersonal intelligence. And this is with our capacity to be able to detect as well as respond appropriately to one's moods, our motivations, as well as desires of others. The 7th one is intrapersonal, and this is the capacity to be self-aware as well as in tune with our inner feelings, values, belief systems, and our ability to utilize our thinking processes. The 8th one is called naturalist intelligence. And in this one, it's our ability to be able to recognize as well as categorize animals, plants, as well as other objects that can be found in nature. The 9th one is considered to be the existential intelligence. Here, this is our ability to be sensitive and our ways of having capacity to be able to tackle those deep yearning questions about our existence as human beings, like what is the meaning of life? Why do we live? Why do we die? Excuse me. How did we get here in the first place? So Gardner, he kind of asserted that regardless of which subject someone may teach others, that being within the arts, the sciences, history, math, or so on, that we should be presenting learning materials in different ways. It shouldn't be just one way. Gardner went on to talk about and point out that anything you're deeply familiar with or that you can describe and convey in any different ways should be done in that manner. Now, he established 2 criteria from developmental psychology. That being, the first is the presence of developmental trajectory for the particular ability that's going to be toward an expert end state. Otherwise, it's saying that individuals really don't necessarily exhibit their intelligence in its raw state, but instead they're prepared to use their intelligence by passing through a developmental process. Meaning people who want to be mathematicians or physicists, they'll spend years studying and honing in on that logical mathematical ability in a distinctive as well as socially relevant way. Now, the second criteria comes from the discipline of developmental psychology, in that the existence of savants, prodigies, as well as exceptional people. Gardner referred to these as accidents of nature that allowed researchers to be able to observe the nature of a particular intelligence in great contrast to others on average or impaired abilities. So an example of this would be to highlight an intelligence of a person who's autistic, that excels in numerical calculations or musical performance. Finally, Gardner drew upon the last 2 criteria from traditional psychology as well as psychometrics to be able to determine if a candidate intelligence would make onto a list of specific abilities that he targeted as multiple intelligence. And there's been support from the experimental psychology field that indicates the extent to which 2 operations will be either related or different. So being able to observe subjects or participants who were asked to carry out 2 activities simultaneously has been able to help determine if these activities would rely on the same type of mental capacities or different ones. An example of that can be a person that was engaged in a crossword puzzle would unlikely be able to carry on a conversation effectively. Not that they can't, but would it be effective? Would they miss out on part of a conversation, or would they miss out on part of the crossword puzzle they're working on? And that's because with both tasks, it demands attention of our linguistic intelligence, and that's going to create interference. Whereas the absence of this sort of type of competition allows a person to be able to walk and converse at the same time, suggests that 2 different intelligences would be engaged. So in spite of the fact that Gardner proposed his theory in opposition to psychometrics, he did recognize the importance in acknowledging psychometric data to the process. So, according to Robert Sternberg's proposed theory on human intelligence, known as triarchic, or Martinez put it as successful intelligence, this is about a common set of universal mental processes that underlies all aspects of our intelligence. So, although the particular solutions to problems that's considered intelligence in one culture can be different from those in another, the mental processes needed to reach these solutions are usually the same. Meta components or executive processes helps a person to be able to plan out what they're doing, be able to monitor things as they're being done, as well as evaluate things that's being done. Performance components would help to execute instructions of meta components. Knowledge acquisition components, they're going to be used to learn how to solve problems or be able to simplify our ability to acquire knowledge in the first place. An example of this, you could think about a student that may plan to write a paper. That would be the meta components. And pretty much writing the paper itself is the performance components. Learning new things while writing would be the knowledge acquisition components. So there's three aspects of intelligence that Sternberg looks at. And according to the triarchic theory, intelligence have analytical, creative, and practical within its intelligence. So with the analytical intelligence, this is when it's involving the components of intelligence that's applied to being able to analyze, evaluate, judge, or do comparison and contrast. Typically, it involves dealing with things that we're familiar with, like problems in which we have to make judgments that can be fairly abstract in nature. There was a study that attempted to show how to identify information processing components that would be used to solve analogies like A is to B as to C is to D, or D1 or D2 or D3. You could think about it as a lawyer is to a client as a doctor would be to a nurse or to medicine, etc. And then there's that encoding component, which that's used to be able to figure out the particular word. For example, the lawyer, how that would mean, while the inference component would be used to figure out the relation between lawyer as well to a client. Research on components of human intelligence has been able to demonstrate that although children generally will become faster in information processing with age, that not all components are going to be executed more rapidly with age. The encoding component first then shows a decrease in processing time as with age, and then it'll increase. So basically, older children will realize that their best strategy is going to be to spend more time in encoding the terms of a problem so that they'll later be able to spend less time in making sense of the encodings or decisions in regards to it. Same can hold true for being able to spend relatively more time for poor reasoners in global upfront type of metacomponental planning when they're trying to solve those difficult type of problems that entails reasoning. People with poor reasoning skills, on the other hand, are going to tend to spend relatively more time in detailed planning as they try to proceed through a problem. Presumably, the better a person can reason, then they'll be able to recognize that it's better to be able to invest more time up front so as to be able to process a problem more efficiently later. Now, in terms of creative intelligence, here we're looking at problems that Sternberg as well as Lubart say that at least 63 people can create various kinds of products in terms of writing, art, advertising, as well as science. So if we look at writing, for example, they would be asked to be able to write short stories for which an investigator would then give them a choice of titles. Uh, and in the literature, it's talking about, it's like Beyond the Edge or the Octopus Sneakers, where In art, the participants would be asked to produce different art compositions with titles that comes from like beginning of time or from earth and an insect's point of view. In these type of studies, the participants, they created two products within each domain. So Sternberg and Lubart, pretty much they found that creativity is relatively, or that, although not going to be fully domain specific. In other words, people are going to be frequently creative in some domains, but not in others. They'll also find that they also found that the correlations with conventional ability are going to be between modest to moderate, and it demonstrates that the test for creative intelligence measures skills that are largely different from those that's measured by conventional intelligence tests. So when we look at the practical intelligence, here we're looking how it involves individuals applying their abilities to the kinds of problems that they will be confronted with in daily life. Things like at work or at home, at school. And a lot of the work Sternberg and his colleagues looked at in terms of practical intelligence really centered on the concept of tacit knowledge. They defined this construct as what one needs to know, which is often not going to be verbalized. It's in order to be able to work effectively within an environment that one has not really been taught to work in the first place. And again, it's not going to be verbalized automatically. So Sternberg and his colleagues, they was able to measure tacit knowledge by using work-related problems that someone might encounter in various types of jobs. And in a typical tacit knowledge problem, they were able to ask people to read a story about a problem someone faced and then rate it for each statement within a set of statements, and look at how adequate the solution to the statement represents. So an example in this particular area would be the measure of tacit knowledge of sales they used. And one of the problems, it dealt with sales of photocopy machines, where a relatively inexpensive machine is not moving out of the showroom, it would wind up becoming overstocked. So the examinee is asked to rate the quality of various solutions for being able to move a particular model out of the showroom. It's those type of examples and exercises that Sternberg and his colleagues use to find out whether practical intelligence as embodied in tacit knowledge would help increase one's experiences, that a person would learn how to understand profits or learn from experience rather than experience per se being present already. That resulted in increase in scores. And some people were able to work at a job for years and acquire relatively little tacit knowledge. More importantly, although these tests of tacit knowledge typically demonstrated no correlations with IQ tests, it did help predict job performance about as well as someone, sometimes even better than an IQ test would. Now, there was also a study in Kenya where Stenberg and colleagues, they looked at school-age children's ability to be able to adapt to indigenous environments. And what they did was devise a test of practical intelligence for being able to adapt to the environment that measured children's informal tacit knowledge, that being of natural herbal medicines and that villagers would use to be able to fight off various infections. Here, the researchers found generally negative correlations between the test of practical intelligence as to the test of academic intelligence and school achievement. So this is saying that people in this context actually emphasize practical knowledge at the expense of academic skills in their children's development. And still again, other studies where analytical, creative, and practical tests were used to be able to predict mental and physical health was with Russian adults. Mental health was measured widely using paper and pencil tests in this study for depression and anxiety, while physical health was being measured through self-reports. And the best predictor of the mental and physical health was actually the practical intelligence measure, which, with analytical intelligence coming in, is second for predictability, and then creative intelligence being a third. So here we can see how the different types of intelligence Sternberg talked about has its uses, but it also could show its limitations. We're not sure just exactly how generalizable the three can be separately compared to using them all together. Now, a simple definition of emotional intelligence, or emotional quotient as it's also known, is to be able to describe the ability to monitor your own emotions as well as the emotions of others, to be able to distinguish between and label different emotions correctly, as well as use emotional information to be able to guide your way of thinking as well as how you behave and that influence on others. Emotional intelligence is what we kind of use when we emphasize with our clients, with our cohort, with anybody we have interactions with. How we have deep conversations about our relationships with significant others, our ability to be able to manage uh, someone that's demonstrating inappropriate behaviors. It helps us to allow to connect with others and to be able to understand ourselves better, as well as live a more authentic, happy, and healthy life. So although there are many kinds of intelligence, and they are often going to be connected to one another, there are going to be some very significant differences between them. Emotional intelligence in our field of psychology, it helps to fill a gap as to the mainstream understanding of intelligence, particularly when it comes to us as psychologists. This field always allows, or it has always seemed to have this general understanding that intelligence wasn't everything, but that with the theories on exactly what the other important components would vary greatly between psychologists and research, because they couldn't really agree on a single concept or idea. Now, when the idea of emotional intelligence first was introduced, psychologists realized it was an aspect of intelligence that's been missing. There's three key researchers of emotional intelligence that help to get an idea of the timeline for the introduction of it, as well as to be able to embrace emotional intelligence in our field of psychology. Salovey, I'm hoping to pronounce his name correctly, but him along with Mayer, they kind of came up with a formal theory, a list of theories for emotional intelligence in the early 90s. And they coined the term and definition to be saying the ability to recognize, understand, utilize, and regulate emotions effectively in everyday life. So it's been their work that helped to kind of push this explosion, so to speak, of the interest in emotional intelligence within academic fields as well as the general public. Looking at the different books and studies and questions on the topic, Salovey and Mayer, they kind of struck a chord in terms of this theory. Now, Goldman, and not too long after Salovey and Mayer introduced theirs, came up with a book in terms of talking about emotional intelligence in the world. As well as other researchers, they began to start running with this. Goldman was one of those psychologists that published Emotional Intelligence back in '95, and it helped to introduce this particular theory into mainstream. He saw emotional intelligence as a vital factor to our success, particularly within children, and proposed that promoting social and emotional learning in children would help to boost their emotional intelligence, would not only improve their learning abilities, but also help them succeed in school by reducing or eliminating some of those distractions that can be harmful behaviorally. His proposal was welcomed by both research community and the general public, and kind of now make it taken for granted that emotional intelligence might be seen just as important, if not more important, than one's individual intelligence. So schools, educators, and education researchers, they've heartily welcomed the idea that emotional intelligence is not simply a genetic, that you have it or you don't type of trait, but that it's a set of skills that can be learned as well as improved upon. Now, another theorist, Travis Bradbury, he came up with emotional intelligence 2.0, and this was that came after the groundbreaking work of Goldman. And Bradbury and his colleague, Jean Graves, they kind of jumped on it and saw the growing interest, and they came up with their own book, again named Emotional Intelligence 2.0. This outlined a step-by-step program that would enhance the work that Goldman's put out. And they proposed that there's 66 evidence-based strategies that can help build emotional intelligence by being able to teach self-awareness, self-management, looking at social awareness, as well as relationship management. Now, a lot of people, like I said, jumped on emotional intelligence, including the Dalai Lama. And this can help you to try to understand particularly how emotions for yourself as well as others can be done, in which you can kind of guide yourself. Now, there's current modalities like mindfulness as well as positive psychology that kind of relies on emotional intelligence when it comes working with their clients. So right now, what I would like to do, this is an assignment that is attached to this particular lecture. I would like to do an exercise with you that once the lecture is completed, you finish viewing it, hopefully you can return back to what you was feeling from the exercise and complete the assignment that's going to be below, and provide your reflections on this particular exercise. So bear with me as we go through this exercise. Now, this exercise on emotional awareness was created by Hugo Alberts and Lucinda Poole, and they're in the Netherlands actually. But what it does is it's going to invite you to try to become more aware of your emotions. And hopefully it'll allow you to get the chance to know your emotions yourself by being able to practice emotional awareness. So what I would like for you to first do, you're probably sitting already, but I would like for you to, if you're not in a comfortable seat, get yourself in a comfortable seated position. Now, you could be sitting on the floor, take a cushion and put it on the floor and sit on the floor if you like, or in a very comfortable chair. But what I want to also ask you to do is to allow your spine to be straight as well as long, and let your shoulders drop. Now that you've done that, gently close your eyes, or if you don't want to close your eyes completely, simply just gaze down in front of you, allowing only for a soft focus. Now, as you're sitting there, I want you to start to notice where your body is making contact, how your feet's touching the floor. Perhaps your back is to the ground or to the back of a couch if you're sitting on the floor against something. Notice how your bones are as you sit straight with your shoulders hunched. Now take time to notice your breath. For the next 5 or so breaths, follow it with each inhale and exhale, feeling or imagining that breath flowing into and out of your body. Okay. Now I want you to shift your awareness from your breath to your body. Begin to scan through the body slowly from your head to your toe. Observe any type of feelings or emotions that's present right now for you. Now you might detect numerous feelings or emotions that's going on throughout your body. And for the purpose of this exercise, choose one feeling or emotion to focus on right now. Take time to notice where in your body this emotion is located. So what part of the body is holding this feeling? How big or small is the feeling? Where are its edges? And are these edges sharp or soft? Does the feeling have a color to it? And if so, is the color changing or does it remain the same? Is the feeling heavy or is it light? This feeling that you're having, does it move or is it still? Is the feeling hard or soft, rough or smooth? If I could touch this feeling with my hand, what would the texture be like? Now, if you were to give a name to this feeling or emotion, what would it be? Can you identify it? Can you give it a label? If a name of this feeling doesn't really come to mind, that's okay. I want you to be kind to yourself and continue to observe the feeling in your body with curiosity and without judgment until the nature of this emotion becomes clearer to you. Finally, I want you to continue to get to know this emotion for at least 5 or so minutes. You can pause the video to complete this. And when you feel that you've reached a level of comfort and understanding of this feeling, gently open your eyes, bring your attention back to the room you're in. I will be also including this list for you to follow in the assignment itself so that you can do it again since this is in the middle of our lecture. Hopefully that also not only allows you to be aware of what you're feeling right now, but it helps to relax you somewhat as you continue on with this lecture. So let's now go into talking about distributed intelligence. Now this is referring to systems of entities that's working together to be able to reason, to plan, to solve problems, to be able to think abstractly, allows you to comprehend ideas and language, as well as learn. Here we're going to define this as an entity as any type of intelligent process or system that includes agents, humans, robots, sensors, and so on. Now, when thinking about it in terms of systems, there's different entities that's commonly specialized in certain aspects of a task at hand. For us, as a human, we're familiar with distributed intelligence in the sense of teams of different human entities. We can also see this as what we call distributed logic, and that's referring to separating processing of a larger system into multiple subsystems and being able to extract certain information from our main system and placing them into separate machines, so to speak. So consider ourselves again in information processing and looking at ourselves as a computer. It's the centralized mainframes in which we would take data entry validation and other pre-processing steps from that mainframe to what we can call intelligent terminals in order to be able to relieve the central processor of our brain. Ultimately, the theory of distributed intelligence emphasizes our ability to use things, people, resources beyond ourselves to be able to act more intelligently. Martinez brought up the question, can intelligence change? When we speak about genetic influence, Plowman and Dearies in 2015, they discussed in their article how they see intelligence as being a core construct in differential psychology as well as behavioral genetics, and thus we should look at it also in terms of cognitive science. And it's considered to be, based on their work, best predictors for important life outcomes like education or occupation, mental and physical health, as well as wellness and mortality. In their words, intelligence is one of the most heritable behavioral traits. So they highlighted 5 genetic findings that they found to be special in terms of intelligence differences, and that they felt to be important in implications in terms of the genetic architecture as well as gene hunting expedition, so to speak. First one being the heritability of intelligence. Here they say it increases about 20% from infancy to about approximately 80% in adulthood. Our intelligence captures genetic effects on diverse cognitive and learning abilities, and it correlates phonetically, average on 30%, but it's also correlated genetically at 60% and higher. Assortative mating was another one that they came up with in terms of seeing it as greater for intelligence. That being when they looked at spousal correlations being approximately 40%, then other behavioral traits, and that such personality and psychopathology also demonstrated at approximately 10%, or physical traits like our height or weight at approximately 20%. So assortative mating pumps additive genetic variances within a population through every generation contributes to a high narrow heritability, that being additive genetic variance of intelligence. And then there's the fourth thought they had, which was an unlikely psychiatric disorders, that intelligence would normally be distributed with positive ends of exceptional performance that's considered to be a model for positive genetics. Their fifth area that they looked at and reviewed was intelligence being associated with education as well as social class, and how it would broaden causal perspectives on how there's 3 intercorrelated variables that would uh, contribute to the social, the mobility, as well as health, illness, mortality differences. When we look at nature versus nurture, there's some genes that may alter brain chemistry so that a person is better able to learn. Then there's going to be other genes that could cause behavioral differences, and it's causing some people to, be more selective, self-select, or as well as being stimulated from the environment. And so it's likely that the genetics of intelligence actually works, at least within part, through a genetic influence on the environment. This means that a genetic basis for intelligence is as much about one's nurture as it is about one's nature. Intelligence is the most widely studied trait within behavioral genetics, and it's going to be correlated with a suite of different characteristics that ranges from our social economic status to our lifespan development, even to happiness. So as we continue to ask ourselves about whether or not intelligence can be changed, we have to also take a look at the Flynn effect. This is referring to how we've observed the rise of IQ scores over time, which resulted in norms obsolescence. And so, although the Flynn effect has been widely accepted, most approaches to estimating it have relied upon basically a scorecard approach that would take estimates of its magnitude as well as the error of measurement, has been controversial and actually prevent determination of factors that would moderate the Flynn effect across different IQ tests. There's been meta-analysis conducted to help determine the magnitude of the Flynn effect with a degree of high precision, and to be able to determine the error of measurement, as well as access the impact of several moderator variables, which will be within a mean size. So Martinez, he kind of believed that a likely reason behind the rising of IQ scores was that it spread it through the schools around the world. And since it started within the 20th century, that particularly elementary education was more universal, and that kind of led to these higher rates of literacy uh, in terms of wealth. And the poor countries, they didn't get it as much. Additionally, this increase within the averages would be as far as looking at secondary as well as higher level education. It allowed for a larger segments of the population to kind of look within the abstract as well as more complex subject matters, which included math, science, and literature. So as we further explore the environmental influences, we have to look at how biological environmental influences like malnutrition, exposure to pollutants, drugs, as well as social environmental influences like education and early interventions, as well as the social economic status, will play a part in terms of intelligence. And much of the research on the relationship between intelligence and the environment has actually been mixed. It's been evident that the relationship between environmental factors and intelligence would likely be highly complex as well as transactional in nature. And while the environment definitely has an impact in terms of changing intelligence amongst humans, continued research has been where there's a need in order to be able to meet the methodological challenges that would often come up in this particular topic. So more or less, the more exposure a child has to different experiences, the more likely this is going to increase a child's learning as well as improve their level of intelligence. And this is including being able to provide cultural exposure. And since the 60s, research has been able to demonstrate that increased exposures has led to a positive effect on education, social economic status, as well as social development. And from the research, there were several programs that have been developed to help provide opportunities to give additional exposure. And that's in particular with starting preschool, like with Head Start. Now, education, excuse me, became even more prevalent in two additional ways. One being, Martinez mentions the expansion of elementary school education, and therefore literacy rates had increased not just here in the United States, but all around the world. Both rich as well as poor nations alike accepted one basic responsibility that the government entailed, which was to provide a universal type of education. That being a basic right for kids to be able to get education that would help guarantee at least the fundamentals in terms of literacy and numeracy. Another dimension to the education expansion was the average duration for schooling. Here, of course, in the US, when we talk about a typical duration, we're looking at from elementary school to at least receiving some form of higher education, post-secondary. And in these circumstances, it became broad like this globally, in which there's been a move toward higher education throughout. So now we ask the question again, can intelligence be taught? The answer is yes. Research indicates that it should be possible for us to be able to understand those complex psychological processes that enables people to be able to solve problems, construct, uh, what we understand as intelligence. Martin, a professor of psychology as well as empirical education at the University of Luxembourg, discussed that we can design programs to be able to teach people how to adapt and increase their intelligence throughout their lifespan. And this would help involve by having an open mind to the possibility that we can actually revolutionize education. This revolution would include or offer a path that would actually equip students of all backgrounds to be able to attain knowledge within the economy of academic learning, even those who would be deemed as non-academic. Martin further discussed how educators, governments, international bodies, as well as researchers need to be able to work together to unlock secrets behind people learn to become intelligent. We use those qualities of the experiences, our experience, and it's those experiences that help us to learn and further ourselves. If you think about the Wexler, and you think about when we use the whisk and the waste, those questions also demonstrated within that IQ test things that you would only gather within your communities, within exposure culturally, not just simply from textbooks. And we are able to demonstrate and be able to measure. Although we have that understanding because the inclusion of such, and they've made changes, of course, throughout the years, but because of these changes, the cultural exposure is even more so important if we're to have a chance to be able to demonstrate that through measurable efforts, being able to include the cultural complex. So ultimately, cultivating intelligence has many different facets, and looking at how to expand it through education is that goal ultimately. So finally, Martinez talks about learning strategies that we can utilize that's going to help in terms of intelligence. And of course, these you will be able to find further details about within the chapter. I'm not going to read every word for word. That's going to be what you can do on your own in your reading. But just to point out the main facets of it, that being aim to enhance intelligence. And we discussed throughout the theories how that can be done. Now, one thing I didn't go through everything about Benet or looked at all the particulars. There's some reading that you will have to do. I kind of just pointed out emergent theories in this lecture. But of course, we look at Ch10 and talk about how to improve fluid intelligence in terms of problem solving. And you can get that information as well. When we're talking about fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence, how do we build upon it? How do we strengthen it? Of course, if we can promote voluntary reading, the more we read, the more we learn, as they say. Diversify instruction to be able to reach intelligence profiles. That's that cultural component that I mentioned and spoke of. Try to encourage the management of complex goal structures, bringing more into what we are trying to learn, not just the simple, but challenging ourselves. Emphasize the need for inductive reasoning, cultivate that emotional intelligence, which is bringing me back to that reminder that after this lecture, please do complete the reflective component to the exercise that was performed, and a list of the outline of the tools that I used in that exercise will be attached so that you can see it again. Also, we want to be able to teach students that intelligence is malleable, it's flexible. We can make it what we want it to improve on ourselves. And as always, we want to promote good nutrition because we know that biologically it's necessary. So in conclusion, we discussed the emergent theories of intelligence and how to broaden those traditional theories and look at how we can make changes and varies through our experiences, as well as how to cultivate intelligence. Again, I've only honed in on certain aspects of the chapter. The expectation is that you will read the entire chapter. And please, if there's any questions that you have in any of the sections that I did not cover today, that you will send me a question in the inbox and I'll be happy to answer that for you. And on that note, this is the final lecture that I'm giving for this semester. And it's been a challenge to say the least. I do hope that this information has been helpful for you. Next week will be a review in the sense of that you'll have the opportunity to, if you haven't read all the chapters, please do read those chapters or complete your reading in your chapters, as there will be practice exams that will be presented to help with your review, and then finally the final examination. Again, if there's questions or concerns, do not hesitate. If you need to have a check-in with me and you would like a face-to-face conference, please feel free to make that request and we can set that up. Otherwise, this is probably the last time you'll hear my voice for this course, and it has definitely been a pleasure.